Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome this afternoon to this Burton Suite charity catch-up. We're delighted that you have been able to make it along. Our time together will be for an hour, and a very warm welcome to you if you are here for the very first time to one of these Burton Suite charity catch-ups, or if you're here as a regular, it's great to see you back. My name is Ed Marsh. I'm Head of Charity Development at Burton Suite. And I'm here with my colleague Cecile Gillard, who is Charities Legal Manager at Burton Suite. And as we run this event today, as a team, we are very much committed to supporting the sector in all kinds of different ways. And you can see kind of some of our kind of key services on the slide there, but very much committed, involved in the sector to help and to provide the support that you need to navigate the important areas of running your charity well. We know that many of you work with us already, but if you are here today and you'd be interested in finding out more about our services, then we'll be sending an email around after this event, and you'll have a chance to get in touch with us and to ask us more. Just want to also give mention at the very start to an event that we've got coming up very shortly, the 28th of January. For many on this call are involved in the faith sector, and we're running a very special in-person event for faith charities on Saturday, the 28th of January. That's a Saturday morning from 9 till 1, and that's taking place at Woodlands Church. We're running it in partnership with a number of other organisations, particularly Woodlands, the Woodlands Church family. But you can book online using the link there, woodlandschurch.net/faith charities in focus. It's wonderful to have a speaker from the Charity Commission coming down with us, to be also having the charity stewardship and the charity finance group involved as well as the Association of Church Accountants and Treasurers. It will be a great event for all faith charities to be involved and to really explore some of the issues that are relevant, particularly to faith charities. And as well to explore how is it that we can be excellent at being trustees and leaders of faith charities. And so we would love to join in. We'll mention a little bit more about this event a little bit later on today as well. Our topics today are on the screen there. We're going to be talking a bit about organisational purpose and effective leadership, particularly from the Charity Governance Code. We're going to be revisiting the whole topic of reserves. It's something we cover quite frequently on these charity catch-ups, but it's absolutely vital topic to be considering at times like these. We're going to be considering fundraising appeals and getting it right, and what to do when it goes wrong. And then, as usual, we're going to be just giving you a whistle-stop tour of some of the latest news from the sector, things that it's good for you to be aware of, things that you might want to dig in further. But we would love it as well to have your contributions today. And what we'll be doing is, towards the end of our event today, we'll be opening up for questions and comments that you might like to make. A couple of ways to do that. I mean, anytime throughout the event, please use the chat function on Zoom to either make some comments or store up your questions for later on, or perhaps just give some observations of your experiences. What we'll do is we'll pick up some of those later on in the event, and there'll also be an opportunity to come on screen as well to ask those questions as well. And just to say a bit of housekeeping, you are muted for the duration of this event until the end with the questions, just to make sure that there's no kind of interference in the sound quality at all today. But also, we are recording this event, particularly for the benefit of those who have not been able to make it along at the time live now, but signed up and wanted the recording later on. So we'll send you that recording later on, so that you can revisit any of the content too. But just to assure you that there'll be no names or faces on that recording, so there's no need to be concerned about that. We'll also drop that email to you hopefully later on today with a copy of the slides that we're using today, as well as that recording. And we would love it if you could respond with any feedback that you've got about the event today, and any suggestions for future topics. We very much take those on board and seek to include them where we can. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cecile to head into our first session.
Thank you very much, Ed. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Very lovely to have you all with us today. So we're going to start by looking at organisational purpose and how effective leadership can contribute towards your organisational purpose. Thank you, Ed. Now, when I talk about effective leadership, I will particularly focus on trustees, but I think you can also take to heart some of these thoughts and ideas in relation to senior leadership if you're in paid senior charity leadership, so particularly at management level in a charity as well. One of the most fundamental aspects of every charity is its organisational purpose. It is the very reason that the organisation exists, and it drives everything that you do. The legal term, of course, here that we're talking about for organisational purpose is the charitable purposes of the charity. That may be a single charitable purpose. In some charities, it will be more than one charitable purpose. So charitable purpose, that's the organisational purpose of a charity. In the older legal language, that's the objects, and your governing document, your constitution, may use that older language depending on how recently you've reviewed it, how long ago you were set up. But the modern legal term, charitable purpose. Every charity must have charitable purposes that are for the public benefit and that are for that benefit in a charitable way. The purposes are what drive choices about what activities the charity does. Because of the purposes, charities can carry out some activities, and in certain charities, because of the purposes, they must carry out particular activities. The purposes are what drive who should benefit and how they should benefit. Sometimes, because of the purposes, the who is everyone. Sometimes it is people in particular circumstances, people with particular needs. The purposes also drive what the charitable outcomes should be, what should result from the charity's activities. Thank you, Ed. Now, here are a random selection of charitable purposes. Some of them are really very obvious about what should be being done. So the purpose of saving lives is clearly going to target how we go about our business, where we go about our business. We're about saving lives at sea and on inland and floodwaters. So we are about people at risk in those areas of water. We're not about, for example, rescuing people who've got into difficulties on a mountain. That would be for another charity to do. We are giving benefit to the general public here because saving lives is a good thing for society as a whole, but specifically we're about saving those at risk to their lives in those particular water environments. The other examples too, giving help to people who are suicidal and giving help in ranges of ways which are open to the trustees to choose, including compassion and befriending activities. So exactly what mix of activities that charity does, there is some discretion for the trustees. The public education one then, the third one down, clearly about education in relation to a particular, let us assume here, historic house and the estate that goes with it. So we're not talking about history in a particular period. We're not talking about history in the context of a particular group of people. So we're not talking about, for example, the history of Europeans or the history of Australians. We're talking about history as it relates to that location. That's the business we're in, if you like. Promoting rehabilitation of people convicted of criminal offences. Again, very clear who the principal beneficiaries should be and what the outcome of the charitable activity should be. They are rehabilitated. They don't offend again. And the final one, protecting the natural environment and wildlife in a distinct geographic place. And the one above it, either preventing or relieving poverty, but the mix of activities very patently stated to be at the trustee's choice. Thank you, Ed. Now, the Charity Governance Code sets out principles that charities trustees should use in the governance and the leadership of their charities. And principle number one, there are 7 of them supporting the foundation principle. Principle number 1 is that the trustees are clear about the charity's aims and they ensure that those are being delivered effectively and sustainably. To apply this principle, you need to be quite clear, therefore, on what your charitable purposes are. What are we here for as a charity? Who? Why? What can we do? What must we do? And what should result from what we do? Setting the strategic aims for the charity, those questions are fundamental. To understand the purposes and their consequences and the demands on the charity that those make. It's fundamental that you understand your purposes in order to set a strategy for delivering on that in ways that are effective and sustainable. And to do all of this, you need to understand the environment in which the charity operates, the aspects of that environment that you can influence and the aspects you cannot. The rehabilitation charity for prisoners, for example, isn't in a position to determine public policy on sentencing and how long people serve in prison. So that aspect of its operating environment is not within its control. You need to understand too, in the external environment, areas where things are changing or not, and where things are perhaps not what you had predicted or expected. Your trustees need to be clear on what available resources the charity has, how those resources are being used, where there is flexibility or options to change the resource use. You need to identify where resources are stretched, where more may be needed, where current use may not be effective enough or may not be sustainable for the future. And in seeking to deliver on this fundamental principle about being clear on aims and ensuring effective delivery and sustainable delivery, you need to keep your core focus as trustees on what the charity's strategy is, but knowing why it has chosen that approach. So trustees need to identify and understand how the charity is performing as well under that chosen approach and obtain assurance that what was expected and planned is proving to be the reality. Thank you, Ed. So what does all of this suggest that trustees should be doing? Well, actions to consider, I think, to help provide effective leadership in relation to organisational purpose would certainly include these. Again, knowing what the purpose is, making sure that the strategy and the reality of the activities that are pursuing the purpose are effective. Regular review of the purpose keeps you on track with this. And sometimes that might point to a need to consider whether there are options for changing the purpose. Often it may point to need to adjust activities, but fundamentally the purpose underpins everything, and it could be that the purpose itself needs revisiting. Now, there are legal complexities and practical challenges around making an alteration to a charity's purpose, and we often help and advise charities with all of that thinking, and where it's appropriate to do so, then maybe taking into action areas of change. Our strategy must support our purpose, so our trustees need to be making meaningful decisions about what our charity is doing, what the results of that are, and what lasting differences are flowing from those results. The do, the result, the difference. Our trustees need to be able to explain clearly how that change of outputs, outcomes, and impacts is providing public benefit. So who is benefiting? How? What positive difference is being made to them and to society? And how does all of that directly relate to our charitable purpose? For example, preventing or relieving poverty, rehabilitating those who've been convicted of criminal offences. And of course, you can only do all of those things if you are evaluating the impact of what you do and the results of that activity, if you can know what the impacts are being. Yes, that involves counting numbers, but it involves a lot more than that. It involves finding meaningful ways to assess the results and the effectiveness of the results of the activity. And that is your foundation then for reviewing and planning and adjusting the strategy, as well as, of course, working out whether the strategy you've adopted is being effective and whether you need to take actions to make it more so, to enhance it. Thank you, Ed. I think an area that can be quite challenging for trustees in giving this organisational leadership is how you assess the external environment and its impact on the charity. I think also it's a clear challenge to plan for sustainability. The code urges us to do so, but the challenge factor there is, I think, quite considerable. So what do trustees need to be thinking about on this aspect? Well, I think certainly what are the charity's income sources and how might those be affected by external factors? The current cost of living issues is clearly one of those factors. You need to be thinking about adequacy of income, about what the income sources were and how they might be affected by external factors. You need to think about changing and growing needs, or adequacy of income against rising costs is certainly a challenge for every charity I know at the moment. You might need to investigate the possibilities for working in new or different ways with others. Remember that those ways of working with others may have expected benefits, and that may be why you're going to consider them. But also, of course, there will always be risks in deciding whether you work with others. If you make a negative decision not to, there's a risk. If you make a positive decision to do so, there's a risk. So you need to balance benefits and risks. And as trustees and volunteers and staff and indeed advisors committed to working to support charities and make them effective, we all need to recognise that charities do not exist to sustain themselves, but rather they exist to bring about lasting benefits. So possibly for some charities, at some point in their lives, a formal merger with another organisation might be the most effective way to deliver the organisational purpose in the future. Perhaps you even need at some stage to consider closing down some of the activities, or even closing down the whole charity and giving its remaining resources to another charity with comparable purposes, if that will make better use of the resources and achieve better charitable outcomes against continuing as a charity in your own right, trying to pursue the activities yourselves. But always, trustees need to be thinking about the wider context, reviewing their charity and making decisions with an informed eye on the wider context in which you operate. What is it that's happening to your communities at the moment that's relevant to your work? What matters to your stakeholders? That would clearly include beneficiaries, donors, volunteers, and yes, the wider public. And what are the environmental issues affecting the charity and the wider world? Well, those are valid questions, but they need to be focused. So the conversations, the decisions, and the rationale for the decisions need to be rooted in accurate and evidenced knowledge about your purposes, values, resources, your activities, the effect of the activities and the outcomes, and consistency with your purposes, your values and resources. Wider world context, very important, but against that focus. So that makes us think about our organisational purpose, and hopefully buzzing in your head now is what your charity's charitable purpose is, which will be really relevant to what Ed will talk about now, about managing resources. Ed.
Thank you, Cecile. Very helpful thoughts there and very relevant to us at these times. As I said earlier on, we're going to be talking a bit about revisiting reserves. It's something we talk about quite a lot at these charity catch-ups, and that's because it is such an important topic, and it's no more important than it is right now in these challenging times. We are, as we know, in the middle of a real economic crisis and a continued kind of cost of living pressures. There are real issues over the availability of funding, where local authority budgets are just kind of not adding up. We are in an environment of rising costs, and that's caused a lot of concern even over this last week to hear the announcement that the government support for charities around energy bills will be reducing from March, and that is a concern to many charities. It perhaps for many threatens their existence, the continuation of their work. And of course, this is where good governance comes to the fore. This is where exactly those messages that Cecile was talking to us about are so vitally important in these times. And actually, when it comes to reserves, there is a real need for us to be proactive, to really plan and to really understand what we're doing and to be able to exercise our duties well. And actually, one of those core duties, of course, of the trustee is to act in the charity's best interest. And actually, when you're in a situation where there are very difficult choices to make, we are in a position where we kind of need to say, how do we make those very difficult choices around limited resources, and how do we make sure we're acting in the charity's best interest as we do that? And in fact, this illustrates a little bit of what the stark choice is for many charities, and it might be extreme in some cases, or it might actually just be a kind of a smaller, sort of more minor version of this choice. But actually, there is a balance to strike in a time when the numbers don't quite add up, in a time when costs are rising and it's just not working out the way it was before. There is a choice. Either actually, should we reduce costs now? And obviously there's a limited amount that can be done around reducing discretionary expenditure, about a limited amount about sort of eliminating non-essential spending. Actually, there might come a point where there's a choice to make about reducing activity, reducing the benefit that can be provided to our beneficiaries, reducing services or eliminating services. There's a choice to either to reduce those costs now, to preserve the work of the charity in the future, to make sure that there are future beneficiaries that can be helped. Or it might actually be, how do we will just plough on and we'll continue to meet the immediate needs that are right in front of us. And that will mean that will potentially threaten our ability to help future beneficiaries because we're using up reserves, or we're in a situation where we just can't kind of sustain that level into the future at the current level. So it is a stark choice. It's a choice often for charities between current beneficiaries and future beneficiaries, and how do we get that balance right, as or what is in the charity's best interests as we do that. And I guess really the important thing for us to bear in mind if we're faced with that kind of situation is that there is some essential work that is needed from a governance point of view. It is absolutely vital from a reserves point of view that we understand the funds that our charity holds, that we understand where those funds are coming from, that we understand how we are spending those funds, and more importantly, how those funds can be spent. And so it's really important to understand that. And we're covering this again today, having covered it fairly recently, partly because actually this is an area in our experience is a commonly misunderstood area. It's something that people struggle to get to grips with, where they have issues kind of really distinguishing between different types of funds. And hopefully you'll be reasonably familiar with this diagram, which says that actually charities can hold different kinds of funds. On the one hand, there's unrestricted funds. They are funds that can be used within the broad spectrum of a charity's purposes. And they might be general funds that are kind of unearmarked. They are kind of really for any purpose that are within the ultimate charity's purposes. Or it might be that there are designated funds, which I'll talk about in a minute. It might be that actually there are special trusts over funds, and actually there are legal restrictions over how those funds can be used. And it's so vitally important to understand that and to get to grips with what funds you as a charity hold that are subject to those kind of legal restrictions, because that very much affects your ability to make a sensible decision in the best interests of the charity. So just to summarize, as I said, unrestricted funds to be spent to further any of the charity's purposes at the discretion of the trustees. Designated funds are the decision of the trustees. They are a choice to earmark funds for a particular future purpose, perhaps for a particular project, a particular initiative you've got coming up, or make a commitment to a certain line of work. And there's a choice to set those aside, and that can choose to designate them, you can choose to undesignate them. So effectively, they are available potentially to use. Whereas, of course, those restricted funds, charity law dictates that restricted funds are restricted for the particular purpose for which they exist, for which they were given. They arise in, well, 2 or 3 ways. Either a donor comes along and specifies this is what these funds are for, this is what you need to use the funds for, or perhaps you've put out an appeal for funds for a particular purpose. We're going to be covering that shortly. And then in sort of rare cases, well, occasional cases, the Charity Commission might direct certain funds to be held as restricted funds. Won't dwell on endowment funds. It's usually less common, but actually many charities have funds that are given to provide an asset base to finance the future of the charity. They might be permanently endowed funds, they might be expendable endowment funds where there's some flexibility over their use, but it's vital for us to understand the nature of our funds. And it is a time as well to revisit the Charity Commission's guidance around charity reserves. CC19 is there for us to look at, and it's really important for us to understand what of our reserves are freely available to us. What are our free reserves? We might have them for various different reasons. We might have them to just meet the day-to-day spending needs that we've got, our working capital needs. It might be that, you know, there's a real risk that our income will drop. Well, we need some reserves to help us to buy some time to restructure the charity to go forward. Reserves might be there to make sure that there is an orderly planned closure of the charity if that becomes necessary at any point. Actually, reserves are there for emerging opportunities as well. But actually, in our context, it's these unplanned adverse events which are very much a reason to hold free reserves. And actually, quite often people think about free reserves as, you know, funds for a rainy day. Now, it is very literally a rainy day today, but also in the world we're living in at the moment, in the economic environment we're in, actually, it might very well be that we define the current situation as rainy days, where actually there might need to be a choice to dig into our free reserves to be able to sustain the work of the charity. This is a commonly misunderstood area too. What are our free reserves? Well, actually, if you dig into your accounts, you can actually see what they are. You can calculate them. You start with your level of unrestricted funds, those funds that are available for use. But you take off then any committed funds. They might be tied up in the value of fixed assets, not easily realizable. They might be committed in the form of program-related investments. They might be those funds that are set aside for a future project that actually you want to take. Those are not actually freely available without a real kind of change of plan and a change of strategy. And so when it comes to reserves, what are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves in these challenging times? And it might very well be, as we consider that balance between the needs of current and future work of the charity, actually, can it be that any of the reserves we have that can be released or repurposed to get us through this difficult time? Now, when it comes to free reserves, actually, of course, the clue's in the title. The reserves are freely available to be used for any purpose. And so actually, it might be that you would choose to release and use those funds. But we need to obviously bear in mind that those funds then are used and they're not available for the future contingency that we need them for. But they can be used. Actually, of course, with designated funds, you could undesignate funds and use them to support the work of your charity in an environment of rising costs. But of course, the implication there is, well, we might have to suspend a future project that we had planned. It might very well be that we can no longer be committed to a particular strategy or course of action that we had. But the thing, of course, to be completely crystal clear about is that you cannot release restricted funds for a purpose for which they were given in the first place. And so a real clarity around what reserves are. So when it comes to, you know, some either free reserves or designated reserves might actually be invested actually there are costs of release of actually withdrawing investments. There are perhaps transaction costs involved in that. There are the vulnerabilities of where the market is lying, and actually to the extent to which actually there's real risks there that we need to balance, and we need to fully have our eyes open to those implications. And so it's important for us to take a very proactive view to our reserves. It's important for us to understand what our reserves are, the nature of those reserves, and to make sensible decisions about whether it is in the best interest of the charity to release those. And of course, what it comes down to is having a good awareness of reserves and a good policy around reserves all the year round and every year. And what I've done in the slides that we'll send you after the event is just a little reminder of the need for reserves policy. Actually, to talk a little bit about what reserves are, to give you some top tips around setting a reserves policy and why you should do it, and a reminder of the annual report requirements around reserves. And so we'll send you these slides as a little bit of a reminder of what some of those requirements are, and we'd be delighted to talk to you a little bit more around those areas. But we're going to head in and talk a bit about fundraising appeals now. Over to you, Cecile.
Thank you, Ed. So you probably do make fundraising appeals. Thank you, Ed. Be aware your charity probably does this. You may not think so, but actually most do, one way or the other. Sometimes there's a very clear, direct, deliberate, specific request. For example, a formal funding bid to a funder for a grant, or a specific appeal to your supporter database for, we want funds to do X, Y, Z. But often, and many charities are doing this, on a more regular or a permanent basis, they are in fact asking for funds and inviting and enabling people to give through things like their website, their social media, through publications, communications, actual presentations, physical locations. So think of, say, a collection plate being passed around in a religious service, or as you leave the premises, donation point in, say, a museum. Vast majority of you, one way or the other, will have some form of online donation option now. You'll be corresponding with people, even in conversations. You will sometimes be offering a means by which people can support you and enticing them, as it were, to support you. Think about support us pages on your website as a good example. Thank you, Ed. Now, the fundamental point, of course, is that all funds are held for use within the charity's charitable purposes. But following on from that, the trustees only have discretion on how to use the funds within the purposes to achieve charitable outcomes if no restrictions attach to the use of the donation that resulted in those funds. And Ed has just quite rightly explained the meaning of restricted funds, that they are given for restricted purposes narrower than the overall purposes of the charity in the context of reserves and how you can or can't use available funds. So restricted funds given by someone for a restricted purpose absolutely cannot be used outside the restrictions at the trustees' free will. They don't have any choice. They have to apply them for the purpose for which the charity has those funds. The restriction, and Ed flagged this up, the two most common ways, there is a third way as he pointed out, but the two most common ways the restriction will arise will be the donor themselves chooses to impose restriction by saying my donation is given to be used for X. But equally common is that the charity, in the way that it invited someone to give funds, specified purposes for which those funds would be used. Help us feed children in the school holidays who would otherwise go hungry. You have clearly put parameters around what you're going to use those funds for. You are not then able to use those funds for, say, the sports activities with disadvantaged young people that you do in the summer holidays. You said you would be using them for feeding the children. It is only for that restricted purpose that you may use them. Thank you, Ed. And in overseeing how a charity appeals for funds, trustees must comply with their core legal duties. In particular, that second one, which requires trustees to comply with the law, undoubtedly means that they have to make sure they understand legal restrictions on how funds are raised, and that any restrictions placed on funds, however the funds were raised, are respected and properly observed. Also, of course, they must ensure that fundraising activity is carried out lawfully and responsibly by their charity. Some of that's about general principles and proper behaviour, but some aspects of that are very specific. For example, the law requires the charity's status as a charity and its registered charity number to be included in pretty much all items and communications that might encourage a donor to make a donation. So, ensuring that you respect why you have the funds and you apply them properly are fundamental to getting your charity trustees' duties carried out correctly as the law requires. Thank you, Ed. Now, where we have funds that were created for a particular restricted purpose, we have a potential problem in two ways. First of which, and this perhaps is less common, is that our appeal is too successful. We end up with more money raised than we can actually use for the purpose for which the charity wanted it. There is a surplus. Trustees aren't free to just decide what to do with this. They have to get legal authority. What do we do with the additional sum? Firstly, of course, check whether the appeal actually allowed an alternative use. If it did, then they're free to go ahead and use it within the alternative use. But if it did not, and all too often it doesn't, then the trustees have to consider what other purposes would be suitable and apply to the Charity Commission for authority to redeploy this surplus fund. The law specifically requires the trustees to choose an alternative that is similar to the original appeal purpose and one which will be suitable and effective in current economic circumstances. And I should point out that some of these rules around how you deal with appeals that are not able to be used have recently changed under some changes to the law. Charity Commission expects trustees to think about what will be workable now and in the future. It expects them to think about what new circumstances might be affecting the people who are supposed to benefit from this failed appeal, and how the charity is already working with those people or carrying out the activities the appeal was intended to help. So think about that in the context of how might we suggest using this additional surplus amount in the appeal. The proposed alternative, of course, must be within the charity's overall charitable purposes, and there has to be that consistency with why we made the appeal in the first place. The Charity Commission requires evidence of how and why the trustees have made this choice of intended alternative. And provided they're satisfied, they will give the authority for redeployment of the money. But there's a small exception here, which is that if the surplus is £1,000 or less, then you don't need to go ahead and get Charity Commission consent. Instead, the trustees are free to, using those core principles, make a reasonable and rational and justifiable decision about how to redeploy that tiny sum. Thank you, Ed. Different rules apply in these two circumstances. Legally, if you have a surplus on a grant, you applied for a grant for purposes, probably restricted purposes, you've got an underspend, so you've got money left, then the legal position is you must go back to the grant provider. If the grant terms did allow redeployment, then you can act within those, but where they didn't, and they may not, you need to go back to the provider. The provider may have reserved the right to have the unspent sums back, or they may be open to discussing redeployment and the grant terms may not require return. So you may be able to get their explicit permission. But if you can't, you've got to return it. It can't be used for the purpose it was given. So you'll then have to return it. Where the sum actually came from a donor and it was an unsolicited donation, so it wasn't a response to an appeal made by the charity, but the donor imposed the condition. Although you don't need the Charity Commission consent, and following the process of applying for that, you absolutely do need the donor's consent for any alternative use. And again, if the donor says, "Oh, I hear what you say, but thank you, you can't spend it on what I want it back," you absolutely have a legal obligation to return it. Thank you, Ed. Perhaps more likely than a failure because you have more money is a failure because either circumstances change and what you intended to do, you actually now cannot. And I have an example of that with a charity I'm working with at the moment, where they've been working so hard, these trustees, they've done so well to get the funding together, and they had a great plan, but they now can't do what they intended to do because the way in which a certain aspect of the National Health Service operates has fundamentally changed, completely outside their control, but it's destroyed their ability to fulfill the purpose. That's a good example of circumstance change, but also appeals fail because not enough money is generated. And that clearly is a big challenge at the moment with the financial position we find ourselves in. So where either of those failures apply, again, first, check if there was an alternative use allowed by the appeal wording. If it was, you can follow that. But if there wasn't, then you have to think about how to return the donations to the donors. You have to come up with a suggested course of action to find the donors, to ask their consent for returning and to actually do the returning of the donations. And you have to make sure that you have a good plan in place, and then you get the authority of the Charity Commission. And the principle here is that the law starts from the point this appeal can't go ahead, the activities it was intended to fund can't be done, therefore the donor has the fundamental right to have their money back. If the donor actually said that at the point they made the donation, if you can't use it this way, you must return it to me, then that's non-negotiable. You simply must. But supposing they didn't say anything and you want to try and seek method of return, what actually has to happen? Thank you, Ed. Well, the trustees have to think about how to contact the donors to offer to make this return of funds. A formal decision about that plan is needed. The trustees must come up with a formal plan, and they have to give to the Charity Commission evidence of why they appealed for funds, how they made the appeal. That extends to, for example, copies of the appeal literature. Be careful, please keep good records and watch it with electronic. It's all too easy to have made an electronic appeal and have no record of it. And explain why the donations can't be used as intended. And how are you going to go about contacting the donors? Why is that method reasonable in the circumstances? And also, how do you intend to find people whose direct contact details you don't have? The Charity Commission might require additional information. It might ask for changes to the proposed plan before it allows the charity to follow an action plan and then carry out the return of funds to donors. Thank you, Ed. It isn't necessary to offer returns of funds where the donations were obtained in cash collection. So, for example, sealed collecting buckets at events. It's not necessary to offer to return them where you raised the money by running lotteries, competitions, similar events. And it's not necessary for very small sums. We are talking very small here. You don't need to offer back a donation of £120 or less, provided that during the whole of the current financial year, your donor has not given more than that sum to this appeal. So in those cases, yes, the trustees can decide an alternative use of those funds, but if the total sum that needs redeploying from all those sources is beyond £1,000, you still need Charity Commission permission. Thank you, Ed. And another scenario, my final scenario, is that if it's unreasonable to try to return the funds because of the cost against the donation sum, or because of the type of donation, the circumstances in which the donation made, or how long ago the funds were given, then you don't need to necessarily seek to return the funds, but you have to get Charity Commission consent to that. We do not need to return it because, and you also have to decide proposed alternative uses and get Charity Commission consent to those. So it's complicated how you would deal with any kind of failure in an appeal. The best thing is to get it right in the first place. Ed, how would we do that?
Thank you, Cecile. Absolutely, planning is everything. Being proactive from the start, making sure before, it is so easy, of course, isn't it, with the enthusiasm and the optimism that comes with a new initiative or a fundraising appeal to just launch in. And yet actually doing some good planning is really important. And particularly that is around appeal wording. And what are the things we need to be thinking about doing? I think some of this may be obvious from what we've heard, but I think including a secondary purpose in our appeal wording is a very wise thing to do. Now, in the Charity Commission guidance, there's an example given of wording. This is not a cut and paste, it's an example. So just this example here, we are raising funds to buy a modern scanner for our animal rescue centre. If we have donations left after the purchase, or we are unable to buy the scanner, we will spend your donations on other equipment for the centre. So that's an example of including a secondary purpose. I mean, a couple of things about this. One is that actually, to be clear, that with the wording, it doesn't need to be as specific as other equipment for the centre. It might very well be that the words you include are more about actually we will use them for use the funds for other purposes within our charitable purposes. And so it might very well be, but having that wording is really helpful up front. And I think as well, I'd just like to say it's our temptation quite often to sort of say, how do we get this as small as we possibly can in the small print, along with our privacy policy wording, along with our kind of actually, let's make this helpful to our donors. Let's make this very clear to our donors so they are very clear about the choice they are making when they are donating to your charity. So consider including a secondary purpose alongside the main appeal that you are making. I think as well, the question to ask ourselves with our appeal wording is actually, would a broader appeal be a better strategy? Would it reduce risk in this kind of particular case? And so here's an example of a broader appeal. Actually, it's saying here is an example of one of our projects. To support this and other projects that we run, please give a donation to our charity. Now, of course, what that is effectively doing is saying, please give an unrestricted donation to our charity to support its work. And here is an example of one of the projects. Now, actually, it might very well be that as you consider that kind of option, oh, that's not a strong enough ask. I don't think people will respond to that. I think people respond when they see an actual need and they want to be able to give very specifically to that need. And of course, that is a balance to strike and to make sure that you're kind of thinking through the best way to do that. I know one way in which charities are quite often sought to address that and try to make it as a stronger sense of identification is something a little bit like this, that actually they say, for example, your donation of £100 to our charity could provide meals for 10 children each month, or provide clothing for 5 young girls, or textbooks for 20 students. There's something in there that's saying actually by making your donation, this is the kind of thing that your donation would be able to support in supporting the work of our charity. Of course, you need to be really clear and really careful around the wording that you use, but actually there's a way there of sort of strengthening the impact of a potential general funds donation to the charity. And then, as Cecile has said, it's one of the vital ways it's important for us to get it right is around our record keeping. Record keeping both is important to ensure that we can demonstrate that we have done things well, but also it helps us unravel things when things do go wrong. And so good record keeping involves this. Actually, when you receive a donation, or any donation, but particularly in response to an appeal, that you're keeping a record of donor name and contact details. You're keeping a record of the amount, the date the donation was received, and the donation method. Cecile's already mentioned it's tricky sometimes with the electronic appeals or electronic methods of giving. Actually, on online fundraising platforms, we don't always necessarily have a way to contact the donors directly, but it's important to as far as possible make sure you have access to those records to be able to contact the donor if you need to make sure you keep any letters and emails that were collected alongside the donation, to ensure, and this might sound obvious, but keep a copy of the appeal literature that you sent out or that you advertised. And this is absolutely vital. Keep the records of any gift aid claimed. Now, you're required to do that anyway, up to 6 years after a donation was made. But actually, of course, the gift aid attributable to a donation in response to appeal is part of that donation. And so actually, if there is a need to return a donation, if there is a need to redeploy a donation, you need to be able to consider the gift aid with that donation too. And then if there were any other conditions attached to the donation, you need to make sure that you have a clear record of those things. So hopefully that's helpful. And we very much the message is get your head around this concept. Make sure you understand what you need to do up front, the planning. But then hopefully as well, you found it helpful to understand some of the actions that you need to take and some of the parameters around that if things go a little bit awry. It's great to have some questions in the chat already, and in a few minutes time we're going to take a chance to address those questions. But firstly, I'm just going to hand over to Cecile just to give us a few kind of short headlines of the things to bear in mind just at the minute.
Thank you, Ed. So I think three things really we particularly wanted to draw your attention to. There has been some comment from the Charity Commission around managing the cost of living crisis. It's not got any magic bullets in it. And I think the thing we particularly really wanted to draw your attention to was to make sure that you are looking at that in terms of both your financial and your strategic planning now and in the year ahead, and keep a close eye really on your monitoring, because both the impact on the people you help, the work you do, and of course the running costs of the charity is not going to be something that will very significantly reduce in the foreseeable future. So I think really what the Charity Commission is telling us to do is this is something you've got to pay constant attention to, and I think we would tend to agree. Second point, the charity annual return. There are changes to the questions for the return you will do for the financial year ending on or after 1st of January 2023. So those who just completed a financial year, I know that's many people at the end of December, you're answering the old questions. There are more, I'm afraid, for this coming year, and some different ones. And I think the third thing I wanted to mention was to speak about the faith-based charities. The Charity Commission really wants to get to know you. We have regular conversations with the Charity Commission, as you might expect, and we realise that they are keen to see that charitable faith-based charities, whether they're for direct religious purposes or whether faith is motivating what they do in social action. There are two types, of course, in that regard in terms of faith motivations. They're very keen that you are registered with them. Almost all of you should be. There's very few that shouldn't. And they're very keen that you understand that this is a positive thing to be within the charity sector, that being a faith community and a charity is a really vital thing for that organisation and its effectiveness, and that you do understand what your responsibilities are and you are complying with them. It is sadly the case that many faith-based charities have missed something, misunderstood something, or in some ways we're getting it really quite wrong. And that's where, again, we would like to invite you to our coming event. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Cecile. Please don't hesitate to ask us any questions about that event. That link for booking will also come around in our post-event mailing as well. It's great to have some questions already in the chat. I have a feeling that some of them might have been answered already in some of the content, but we'll work our way through and have a little look. A helpful kind of two-part question here for you, Cecile. Apologies if I missed an explanation of this at the beginning, Cecile, but please could you explain the difference between charitable purpose and charities objects that we recorded with the Charity Commission when we were first established? And then secondly, Could you comment on the process of updating the charity's objects with the Charity Commission? We've been going for 12 years and just conducted a major strategic review. We haven't moved away from our original objects in any major way, but it was felt by the staff and trustees that the wording of the objects could do with an update to better reflect the current focus of the organisation. What would be the first steps of moving this forward?
Okay, thank you. Firstly, charitable purposes and charitable objects. Objects is the old legal language, now frankly very dated, for charitable purposes. They mean the same things. Fundamentally, what is the reason for your charity's existence? To advance the Christian religion, to relieve poverty. That's the purpose. Objects has the same meaning, and it's the term that old constitutional documents sometimes use, and older charities will tend to have in their constitutional documents. So exactly the same thing. Purposes, charitable legal purposes, charitable objects. Second part of the question, I'm delighted to hear that you haven't moved away in any way from your original purposes, because of course to do so would be unlawful and a breach of trust. You must be, and we rightly are, acting within your original purposes. But the first step you would have to do, and I think you would need to have an informed conversation with someone to help you on this, people like us, is whether there's any legal basis that could potentially justify you making a case for change. Trustees are not free to change their purposes for whatever combination of reasons they want. The start point is you must stay true to the original purposes, and there must be one of a number of legally justifiable reasons why change is needed. So for example, one of the legally justifiable reasons might be that there's now very few beneficiaries in the category that the charitable purposes the objects describe, and a large amount of charitable money is not able to be spent because there are so few beneficiaries. People with disabilities in a very narrow geographic area where few people with disabilities now live, large amounts of money that can't be used. So first step is to ascertain with some proper informed advice whether you have any legal basis for making a case for change, and then thinking about what the change might be, and then going through what is quite a significant exercise of suggesting revised purposes to the Charity Commission and seeking its formal consent. But there's quite a lot underneath that answer.
Thanks. Do get in touch. We'd love to chat to you more about that particular case. Another question here, Cecile. Our small charity was set up in 1982 and has very wide charitable purposes, objectives. Trustees can do anything charitable anywhere. We've considered the possibility and advantages of merging with another charity which has very limited ones, only active in a small area in Kenya. Would this rule out even thinking about it?
Well, of course, I can't say without seeing both your purposes, the other charities' purposes, and knowing a lot more about why the trustees are suggesting this. I'd be very surprised, given the way you describe it, if there was a justifiable case. If you have general charitable purposes that allow the charity to do any of the things that are potentially charitable purposes under English law, you then need to look at things like the background to why you were set up, what the original founders intended, what you therefore have been doing, compare that to what this entity does. I would be very surprised, given what you've said, whether you had a reasonable case for completely restricting the use of your charitable funds to a very small area of activity. Now, you've only mentioned geography, you haven't mentioned purpose there, but if you're allowed to use funds anywhere in the world at the moment, and you only choose to put them in one country, that would be a major departure and may not have a legally justifiable purpose. But again, it's about, as I said to the first question, about is there a legal case here to make? And based just on the question, of course, I can't actually answer that.
Another question here regarding fundraising appeals that are too successful. Is it sufficient to mention in the appeal itself what you will do with any funds received on top of the target? I think that was answered in the remaining content of the session. It is about getting that appeal wording right, making sure that you're making clear that there is a secondary purpose, a wider way in which those funds you would intend to use those funds if the appeal was either too successful or not successful. Cecile, anything more you want to add to that? I think that
I would say don't to the person asking the question there, don't just think about that in terms of overstretching, getting more than your target. Think about whether you'd be wise to have worded your appeal, and of course you have to do it before you make the appeal, in the first place, to allow redeployment of funds if circumstances change, you can't do the project, or if you actually get too little money. I personally think it's very wise in fundraising to always allow some flexibility, and ideally the best flexibility is to say, this is what we're intending to do, and say that very, very clearly. But if for any reason we aren't able to, we will use your funds for other purposes within our charitable purposes as the trustees consider there are needs at the time. Something like that, so you completely power to redeploy to anything within your charitable purposes. That's the ideal, because that gives maximum flexibility.
Thank you, Cecile. We are at time. There's another question in the chat which I think was answered in the content about a de minimis level that the trustees can just use the money if the donor doesn't respond to requests for permission to use the money.
The thing I'd like
otherwise.
to add to that, Ed, is I think there's a misunderstanding in the question. The question starts by if the money was given without an appeal. If a donor gives to you without a restricted purpose, they don't say the purpose, and you didn't say we want it for X, then there wasn't an appeal for restricted purpose funds in the first place. So what you do with a failed appeal is irrelevant. I think you're confusing the person asking the question between funds coming in for unrestricted purposes, which trustees are free to spend how they like within the charity's purposes, and funds coming in with a restriction.
Thank you so much, Cecile. That's helpful. And thank you, everybody else, for being with us today. We're delighted you joined us. We hope that you have found it helpful. We hope you found it informative. We hope that you've learned something. And just to say, we'll send a copy of the recording and also the slides around later on, so that you can refer to those at a later date if you want to. But in the meantime, Happy New Year to you, and many blessings for 2023. I hope it's a successful year, and a year where you feel well equipped to run your charity with excellence, and there's a real sense in which there's such progress in pursuing your purposes this year. We hope that you'll join us at our next charity catch-up. We will we'll soon send around an invitation to that. But meanwhile, have a wonderful rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye for now.